Mineral Energy Groundwater Division, and I look after the Advice, Investment Attraction and Analysis branch, and I'm pleased to be here chairing today's seminar. But before we start, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement to country. I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional owners of this land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present. Thank you. I'd like to welcome you again, and I'd like to say I'm really excited to be here chairing it and actually getting to introduce one of the colleagues in my branch, Andrew, to come and talk to you about hydrogen. Hydrogen's a very topical subject, and it's a very exciting subject for the government and one that they're seeing as a priority moving forward. And Andrew's been and his team have been quite instrumental and quite influential in where the Australian government's hydrogen strategy has come to, and now they're also being involved in the implementation. And one of those, I think, that deserves acknowledgement is their hydrogen tool as well, which is available for people to identify, excuse the pun, the hotspots of where hydrogen could be used. So let me get off the stage here and get Andrew up here to do his thing and talk to you about the hydrogen economy. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Christina, and good morning, everyone. And it's a real pleasure to be here to talk about all things hydrogen and Jules Verne this morning. So Jules Verne, of those who don't know, was a author in the late 1800s. He's considered to be one of the godfathers of science fiction. So he came up with a lot of predictions which have actually transpired in the modern world. And one of those that he talked about was hydrogen. So it's interesting to put it into the context of Jules Verne. So today's talk is going to be, as my personality, I am easily distracted, so it's going to be a little bit all over the place. So there's going to be a little bit of history, hydrogen 101. What else are we going to be talking about? We'll be talking about why governments around the world are so interested in hydrogen. How do you make it? And then I'll finish up with two visions that Jules Verne had of the future that may be applicable to our time at the moment. So let's get this show on the road. So hydrogen, where do you get it from? Well, there's a lot on the sun, but that's not very helpful to us. So, and in fact, the portion of the sun that isn't plasma, the rest of the gas is actually 70% hydrogen. There's not a lot in the atmosphere on Earth either. It's only very little. And in fact, there's very little free hydrogen anywhere on this planet. There's a little bit trapped in some mineral resources underground. And we've also found some in natural gas, so small portions of hydrogen. And in fact, our labs here have measured up to 5% hydrogen in natural gas. But generally speaking, there's not much free hydrogen anywhere. But there is a lot of hydrogen in that blue stuff, the water. And that's going to be the source of the hydrogen, which I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so that's where the hydrogen is coming from. Let's talk a little bit about Jules Verne. So Jules Verne, and he has this wonderful quote here, which I'll let you read, but it's often quoted in the context of hydrogen, and in fact was introduced by our chief scientist in the foreword to Australia's national hydrogen strategy, which I thought was very nice. But he envisaged a world where the fossil fuels would be replaced by hydrogen in the future. And in fact, this book that he's got there, The Mysterious Island, is quite a strange book, to be honest. It's got features pirates, orangutans, nitroglycerin. What else has it got on there? A dugong comes to the rescue. But he also had some other things there. Electric gun. So I love the steampunk electrification things. But he envisaged electric guns. And so you've got to remember, this was a time where even the light bulb hadn't been really invented yet. So the electric lighting first appeared in a public setting at the Paris exhibition in 1878. So 4 years after he published his book. And Edison wouldn't invent the light bulb for another 15 years. So he's pretty on the money. And in fact, around the world today, what have we got? We've got heaps of electric guns. In fact, over 100 countries around the world use electric guns in their police forces. So electric guns, one of the things he talked about. But he talked about many other things that he predicted. Holograms, video conferencing, travelling to the moon. What else did he have? There was a whole stack of other things as well. I've forgotten some of those now, which is a bit of a pity. But he saw a lot of different things. Electric submarines, that was another one. But he was an amazing guy. And one of the things he said was that, these weren't really visions of things, but really just a logical extrapolation of the scientific inventions of the time, where he could see their applicability into the future. All right. One of the other things that Jules Verne was really interested in was travel. Travel and the movement of people and ideas around the world and adventure. So, around the world in 80 days in a balloon, journey to the centre of the Earth, 20,000 leagues under the sea, travelling to the Arctic, the Antarctic, to the moon, all over the place. He's really interested in travel and adventure. And so this is one of the quotes here of an academic now, but he really foresaw the mass migration and tourism that we see today, the relentless movement of people to go and see stuff. And when you think about it, these luxurious, massive floating ships that are like mini cities visiting the Arctic, the furthest reaches of the world so people can see stuff. It's really quite surreal when you think about it. So it's really, that was one of his other things. Okay, so at the time that Jules Verne was writing, they were just entering the second industrial revolution. So the first industrial revolution, of course, saw the expansion of coal-fired energy, and that's the building of factories around the countryside and to operate machines. And so this is on the outskirts of Paris at the time, a painting by Van Gogh. But at that time, if we have a look over here, what was the energy mix back in the days of Jules Verne? So about 7, 8 around here. So that is in fact about 20% fossil fuels and about 80% renewables at that point in time. And as you can see, the enormous transformation in the energy mix over those 200 years since. So now we have in the order of about 85% fossil fuels and a mixture of about 15% renewables and nuclear energy. And this is the challenge the governments all around the world are facing, is that load of fossil fuel and the burning of all that CO2 is leading to climate change, and so we have to look at trying to decarbonise all that within the space of 2050. It seems like an impossible task, but that's where hydrogen may offer us some hope of how to get there. And we've been here before. That's the kind of interesting thing as I was preparing this talk, is looking at where hydrogen has been used in the past. And in fact, town gas was produced from coal, contained about 50% hydrogen. In fact, in some cases contained up to 70% hydrogen. And that was used for almost 200 years. And in fact, the modern natural gas that we see is actually a fairly modern type of invention and only came in the 1960s and 70s. And during that time, that 60s and 70s, there was a transition. We had to move from the old gas, town gas, to natural gas. And that required modification of appliances. So all the appliances had to be changed to host the new natural gas. And that took, generally speaking, in countries about a period of about 10 years to do that. So in Canberra, where we are today, our natural gas system has been all upgraded and could go to 100% hydrogen if we wanted to, but the appliances that we have wouldn't be able to operate hydrogen, so they need modification. But, there has been a transformation from town gas to natural gas to hydrogen is probably what's going to happen in the future. And looking, these big things of hydrogen or town gas back in the day, they were stored all over the world, and there's these fantastic things called gasimeters, which is where the town gas was stored. This is clearly in England because it's a cricket pitch, but all over the world there was these big tanks, and in fact, the skeletons of these tanks often remain. You see that in, I don't know if you watch the ABC and some gritty crime dramas, and they've got the backdrop of this kind of structure at the back. They form a nice atmospheric backdrop. But they're all over the world, and there's some beautiful facades that you see in Europe where they're covered in bricks, beautiful brick facades. But yeah, it was just part of life, right, at that point in time. The other thing that they had were these fantastic town gas powered cars. So during World War I, all the liquid supplies have been used by the military, and so for domestic, what could you do to get around? So you hooked up, you modified your car so you could run it off town gas. This thing would get you about 30 kilometres. So it's not super efficient, but at least it would get you moving. All right, so why all the talk about history and showing you all these old photos? It just seems a bit weird. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that we have experience in domestic situations of using town gas, of using hydrogen. Sure, it was 50 to 70% rather than 100%, but it's not a big jump to go from there to 100%. And it was used for heating and cooking and lighting and for transportation, all the things which hydrogen wants to be used for in the future. We can't go back to town gas, obviously, because it contained 10% carbon monoxide, which is not really good for you. And also it had huge CO2 emissions associated with it. But, we can certainly we can get rid of all that stuff and just use the hydrogen. Okay, so what does Australia plan to do with hydrogen? So Australia released its National Hydrogen Strategy at the end of last year. And these are the key pillars which Australia is looking at. Firstly, decarbonisation of the transportation sector, and in particular, the heavy vehicle sector. So trucks, trains, ships, that sort of thing. All the things that run on diesel, essentially. And that is not a CGI image, that's a real truck. And that truck can travel 1,900 kilometres on a single fill of hydrogen, which, when you compare it to a battery-type truck, that would need a very big battery and would need also a long time to charge that battery. So there's a real advantage about using hydrogen. Hydrogen is also very light. So the equivalent, because you've got to remember that Elon Musk, right, he hates hydrogen, right? So his thing is all about electrification. And he's going, no, we can have hydrogen, we can have battery-powered trucks. Well, the battery on an electric truck would be about 7 to 8 tonnes. So you're already adding that onto your load, whereas hydrogen is quite light and gives you tremendous range. In fact, the Elon Musk and Nikola thing is a very interesting little rivalry going on there. So you've got Elon Musk, who hates hydrogen, and then you've got the Nikola guy who's going, it's all about hydrogen for heavy vehicles, and he's getting all the trucking companies involved in the launch of, in starting to order trucks, hydrogen trucks, into the future. But Nikola is named after the very famous inventor and physicist called Nikola Tesla. So you can understand why Elon Musk doesn't really like these guys. Okay, so that's one thing. So decarbonisation of the heavy vehicle system. The next thing is blending in hydrogen into our natural gas supplies. So you can put in 10% hydrogen into the natural gas, and we can run our appliances just as we would now. It wouldn't actually change anything. You don't have to change the pipes or anything. It's a very easy win in terms of introducing hydrogen into the domestic economy. The ultimate aim is to take that up to 100% hydrogen, and in fact you may have heard in the ACT they're talking about using hydrogen for for the domestic gas supplies, but that would require changes to appliances and also to the piping. So you can't use steel pipes with 100% hydrogen. It makes them, basically makes them brittle. So that's the next thing. The next one is decarbonisation of industry. So that's looking at using hydrogen to replace coal in steel manufacturing. You don't use coal anymore, you just use hydrogen. Use hydrogen for the production of, from renewable sources, for the production of ammonia. So at the moment, ammonia is made from natural gas, but you could use hydrogen from renewable energy to do that. And there's a whole lot of different industrial things that could be decarbonised. In fact, this photo down here is of a plant, the Yarra plant in the Pilbara. That produces 5% of the world's ammonia, and they're just building a prototype sort of demonstration plant at the site, which would, with solar cells and wind power and stuff, to produce hydrogen to start to replace their the hydrogen which they get from natural gas. So that's sort of happening. But I guess the big thing which the Australian government is very excited about is positioning us, Australia, as a clean energy superpower export. So we have heaps of land, right? So we can put up solar panels, wind farms, we have other natural resources, good geological storage resources, coal, gas, heaps of stuff. And we could use that and turn that into hydrogen that we could export for those countries that are looking at decarbonisation but are currently heavily reliant on fossil fuel imports. So countries like Japan and Korea, for example, virtually all their energy comes from fossil fuels. And so if they need to decarbonise, the only option really, they don't have anywhere where they can really do carbon capture and storage. They don't have good basins where they can do that, so they have to change their energy mix. And so hydrogen offers them an opportunity to decarbonise. So these four things: transportation, domestic gas supply, industry, and exports. I get distracted very easily, of course, as you know, and this was the thing I just thought was really cool and I had to share it. It's a hydrogen-powered ship. So it is currently on a 6-year voyage at the moment, completely CO2 emissions free. It has solar panels on top of its surface. It has these little wind things, but the really cool thing is it just gets the water out of the sea, makes this little hydrogen, zaps it, and then it's got a hydrogen store on the ship. And so this ship travels all around the world at the moment. Very cool thing. All right, so I'll get distracted. Anyway, back to decarbonisation. And I think it's really instructive to look at decarbonisation and experiences that Germany has been looking at. So Germany, of course, is a leader in decarbonising its economy around the world, and was going gangbusters there, but then towards the last years, it's really stalled in terms of decarbonising. And this is despite a radical transformation in their electricity supply. So they've now roughly 50% renewable energy, mostly from wind, in terms of electrification. And it kind of underscores the problem that electrification and renewable energy will only get you so far, but then the tough stuff comes to look at decarbonising, decarbonising your heavy vehicle system and your factories and all that sort of stuff. And this is where hydrogen is playing an important role. In fact, the German government has just released its draft hydrogen strategy, and it's looking at essentially moving towards hydrogen and recognising that they will have to import hydrogen into the future. They're not going down the nuclear pathway, so that's their energy policy. They're not doing nuclear. So to get that baseline energy, they're looking at using hydrogen. And this is part of the problem, right? So this is beautiful Tübingen in southern Germany, but the issue is what happens when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining? Electrification. It's not going to help you, right, in this sort of circumstance. You need to heat these cities and you need to turn the lights on. And so hydrogen offers an opportunity to provide that additional heating and energy storage. So you can convert the hydrogen back into electricity to keep the lights on. So it's really quite it's a pathway that Germany are looking at taking. And you may have noticed on Foreign Correspondent, I don't know if you guys watched that, but about 2 weeks ago there was one on the closure of coal mines in Germany. So they've already closed all their black coal mines. They're looking at closing their brown coal mines by, 2038, so in 18 years. So they won't have that baseline power coming into them. So they're looking at supplementing that through hydrogen. How do you make this stuff? Well, there's lots of different ways you can make it. I'm not going to go into all of them. All I will say is the most mature ways is to use electrolysis. So that's where you basically zap water with electricity to produce hydrogen and oxygen. The other way is you use natural gas and coal, and you react that with water at high temperatures, and you can produce the syngas, which is the sexy name for town gas, and then refine that to produce hydrogen that way. So they're the two, sorry, they're the most mature ways. And I'm just going to have a little closer look at those. So, and the stoichiometry of these reactions. These are sort of summary type reactions that don't include all the intermediate pathways. So with coal, for example, you take it to carbon monoxide and then react it with something else and blah, 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 blah. But these are the net reactions. And the interesting thing about this is it gives you the stoichiometry of how much stuff you need to produce one thing to produce another thing. And if we have a look at this, so coal in this case I've just said is basically all carbon. There's a little bit of hydrogen in coal, but when you're producing hydrogen from coal, it's generally you're stripping the hydrogen out of the water. The stoichiometry is really interesting though. So if we look at renewable hydrogen, for every tonne of hydrogen, so 1, you need 9 tonnes of water as a minimum in terms of the stoichiometry of the reaction. And you need about the same amount for coal, but you need less for natural gas, because natural gas already has a hydrogen in it, so you don't need to strip out so much of the hydrogen from the water to make hydrogen. Strip out so much of the water to make the hydrogen. But what's really interesting is the stoichiometry for CO2, right? So for every electrolysis, of course you're not producing any CO2. Coal, you're producing 22 tonnes of CO2 per tonne of hydrogen. And for gas, you're producing 5.5 tonnes per tonne for hydrogen. That's just based on the stoichiometry. And in fact, I saw a report for the HESC project down in Victoria. So their pilot project, which is quite a big pilot project in terms of money, but they're planning on producing, what is it? It's about, I think it was 1 to 3 tonnes of hydrogen, and they're expecting in the order of about 100 tonnes of CO2 emissions. It's not an optimised process, but you're talking about 33 to 100 tonnes of CO2 per tonne of hydrogen. So you may ask yourself, well, that just seems ridiculous. Why would you do that? Well, the thing is, even if you include the cost of the storage of the CO2, it's still cheaper to produce hydrogen that way than it is currently with electrolysis. So these are some figures that came out of were derived from CSIRO's report, which were published in the strategy. And with methane and CCS is the cheapest way that you can currently produce hydrogen. Coal is also very cheap, but electrolysis, the cost is looking at about doubling what it currently is. Now, if a market for low emissions hydrogen is created, however, then it is expected that the cost for the renewable source hydrogen will come down dramatically, because there's incentive then to build cheaper electrolyzers and more efficient equipment, to service that industry. And so CSIRO are expecting that those costs may decrease dramatically, and so over the next 5 years or so. But you can see that, the costs still, coal, even with CCS, works out to be pretty cheap. Right, so you know how I get sidetracked? Well, I'm getting sidetracked again. And there is a thing that kind of troubles me, and I want to put it as a pub test to you guys, right? So, exactly. So this is the thing. Imagine you're sitting in a pub, you've got your beer or your G&T, and I'm coming up to you and I'm going, all right, this is the go. What do you reckon about this? So these costs for the electrolysis assume that you're accessing grid electricity. Now, with grid electricity, you can operate your machines 85% of the time, right? That's what these calculations are based. But is it really legit to say that you're using grid electricity to produce renewable hydrogen? What about in the night time? You can annualize it, of course. You can say, well, over the year, this is my total amount of hydrogen that I'm getting. This is the total amount of hydrogen that I want to produce. This is the total amount of hydrogen that electricity that I will need. I can buy that from solar and wind farms, but in fact, it doesn't really cover the nighttime problem, I would say. Tassie, however, has got it sorted, right? They've got hydropower, so they can provide renewable energy essentially 24/7 to supply these sort of things. And in fact, Tasmania is really looking at positioning itself, apart from the battery of the nation, which you may have heard about, also as a really one of the major export regions of renewable hydrogen power in the world. So they have that advantage. But what about states like, well, the other states which are more reliant on wind and solar, for example? So that's my question to you. Pub test, does it pass the pub test that you can just buy renewable energy credits to cover your renewable energy requirements? Or should you really buy your renewable energy from a source that is providing that power at that time? I don't know. What's your vote? Do you think it's legit? No, no one thinks it's legit. And, you know, I would tend to agree with you. And this is part of the tricky thing that's coming up, right, is how do you certify that the hydrogen really is low emissions hydrogen? And this is something that's being pursued in the National Hydrogen Strategy. Is one of their key recommendations is the certification issue. Is you have to really certify, you know, if you're going to produce hydrogen with renewable sources, then really, and you're going to claim that you're going to use grid electricity, then you should be buying your electricity at that time from a renewable source. Okay, as I say, I get sidetracked. Anyway, righto, let's move on. What are we up to? That's the costs. Yeah. Oh, okay. I should also say that Ensiro's costing, even with the grid-supplied electricity, sorry, if you go off-grid, so you're relying on solar and wind, then the costs would double again, so that would take it up to $10 per kilogram. And if you go, well, actually, I'm just going to use the super, super cheap electricity, 2 cents a kilowatt, that's available in excess time, then the cost would double again. So it'll take you up to about $20 per tonne. The reason for that is you've got this expensive bit of capital equipment, an electrolyser just sitting there, not doing much, just waiting around, and then 10% of the time it runs because the electricity is cheap and stuff. So that system doesn't really work. However, that's not to say that off-grid hydrogen isn't economic in some circumstances. And I've got 2 examples here. There's this one here. So this came out earlier this year that Denham is going to be powered by hydrogen. So Denham's a town of 750 people, expands to 2,000 people in peak holiday season. It's near Shark Bay, I think. Yeah. Yeah, it's currently powered by wind power, about 60%, and then with diesel to provide that firming to the wind. So the company that organises the electricity for this town, Horizon Energy, has said, well, you know what, I think it's going to be cheaper for us to build a hydrogen plant than for us to connect you to the grid. Because this town only generates about $20,000 a year in terms of electricity value to this company, Horizon Energy, right? To connect them to the grid, it would cost, say, 20 to 30 kilometres of transmission lines. Analysts estimate that would cost $2 million a year just to maintain that for $20,000 worth of customers. And then on top of that, to actually build the transmission line costs about $1 million a kilometre. So you can see actually for communities there is a real incentive there and economic basis for some communities that aren't connected to the grid to use hydrogen where they can, if they've got good renewable energy resources, to capture that electricity, store it in the hydrogen, and then when they need it, they can convert it back into electrical power. So yeah, Horizon Energy are going ahead with this. They'll produce a plant which can supply about 100 households worth of electricity. The town is still a little bit nervous about this whole thing. So they're just going to have the diesel backup generators there just in case the hydrogen stuff doesn't quite work. But, you know, that's fair enough. It's a trial, so it's one of the first trials in Australia to do this. The other thing is if you just go really large scale and you get economies of scale. So this project here, the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, is planned between Port Hedland and Broome. 15 gigawatts is a lot, right, of renewable power. That would cover 6,500 square kilometres in solar farms and wind power, it would generate 50 terawatt hours of electricity, which is about 1/5 of the total, Australia's total electricity use at this point in time. So this one project would generate 1/5 of all the electricity currently used in Australia. They're planning on using that as exports to Asia. So producing hydrogen and also producing other products like ammonia. And it's a $30 billion project. The thing is, this is not just one project. There's many very large projects like this which are being planned around the world, around Australia, particularly there's a fight between WA and Queensland at the moment, and attracting these different big projects, but there's a couple of these big projects that are in plan. So clearly there is some sort of economic drive, even though there is some economic value to going really big and producing hydrogen. So this is where it's going to be located here. So that's Port Hedland. That's 6,500 square kilometres that they're occupying. First exports 2027. So it's not too far away. Okay, right. Well, I'm going to have a little change of gear now, and we'll talk a little bit about how GA has been helping in this hydrogen space. So we were tasked by the task force to produce a map of all the best places in Australia where you could produce hydrogen. It became pretty clear to us straight away that you can't just produce one map because it's way too complicated to convey all that information. And so we came back with a system where we said, well, let's do 5 different types of scenarios. All those different scenarios have different inputs and requirements in terms of, some are carbon capture and storage type hydrogen, where the best places to store geological storage. Some are where the best wind is or the best solar is, that sort of stuff. And so we came up with a process of generating these maps from public data sets. And we wanted to be really clear that we're just using national scale public data sets to produce these maps, which we did. And some of them featured in the National Hydrogen Strategy, which is very nice to see. But I'll just walk you through some of these which we were asked to look at. So this is one here from the task force. So the task force are really keen to know where's just the best renewable places where the renewable energy resource in Australia. So not confined by any existing infrastructure or anything like that. Where, if we wanted to put in something, where could we do it? And so we looked at producing a map like this. This shows, where the best co-located wind and solar resources are, which are in the dark greens. And you can see that, in fact, there's large parts of Australia have these sort of dark green spots. Okay, it just automatically changed, but that's okay. The next thing we were interested in was renewable hydrogen. So that was the resource. You can see that all over Australia there was pretty good spots. But then when you say, well, actually, now we need to consider existing infrastructure. So where are the electrical power lines? Where are the ports? Where are these sort of things? And so once you incorporate that, you can see that that big open resource starts to be constricted and is confined by the existing infrastructure, particularly power lines. And it's worth noting that Tennant Creek here, as you saw in the previous one, was all very green around there. But because there isn't infrastructure that connects it to a port and electrical transmission lines, it's not included in our map. This is a real advantage of what we're doing, is we could say that, if you do connect that, you open up that area. So planned infrastructure could really open up different parts of Australia for additional hydrogen production and electricity production. And in fact, this area, the Tennant Creek, I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's this project which is called the Sun Cable, and it would go connect Tennant Creek with huge amount of renewable energy resource, big cable here, and then it goes to Singapore. And it would provide pure renewable energy just zapping into Singapore from Tennant Creek. Quite an ambitious project, I would say, but it just go to show that it is actually a very good resource in that area. Likewise, actually, Bob Cato, his plan is to connect from here to here. And again, there's a pretty good resource around here in terms of solar energy. So in this example, just recapping, we only considered that the water was coming from coastal desalination in this case. We weren't using inland water resources. So we produce the electricity inland, that gets or somewhere near, and that gets taken to the coast where the production facilities are, goes into a ship, and then off it goes. Okay, oh yeah, and this is the location of many of the hydrogen projects currently around Australia. So when we plotted those up and it fell on our map and it was all nicely in the green areas, we're very happy to see that. So our map's not too crazy, right, in terms of using those national data sets. There's more projects now, we're mapping out those and we'll be putting them on as well. All right. One of the other scenarios that we were asked to look at by the task force, which didn't make it into the hydrogen strategy, by the way, was what happens if you produce hydrogen inland and then from using renewable sources, and then you export it you transfer it as a gas to the port. So you're not transferring the electricity to the port, but you're transferring the gas. A little bit, there's some issues there around access to water. So this is just assuming that you could get that water from that resource, but of course the water resource in many parts of Australia is fully committed, and it's not that easy to get it. We also looked at a CCS hydrogen scenario. So in CCS hydrogen, as you saw before, you can react coal or gas with water at high temperatures, and you can produce hydrogen, but you also produce a lot of CO2. And to sell that hydrogen as a low emissions fuel, you'll have to store that CO2 in geological storage. So there's four current sort of spots around Australia that seem fairly reasonable for geological storage. And that is where the Gorgon project is up here in the Carnarvon Basin. You've got the Surat Basin over here, the Cooper Basin, and then the Gippsland Basin down there. So based on co-location of, if you're really doing this, you need to be able to store it somewhere. That really constricts to some degree where you can actually perform the geological storage. I should mention that down here in the Gippsland Basin is that project which I mentioned before, which is Australia's big pilot demonstration of turning coal into hydrogen and supplying the Japanese market. So they're doing a pilot demo at the moment, and we'll be looking at doing a commercial scale project maybe in the 2030s. And they would look at using brown coal to produce hydrogen and then store the CO2 in the Gippsland Basin and then take ships of hydrogen up to Japan. It's all very well to have these national scale maps and say, oh yeah, you can put it wherever you like, but it's also good to tie it back to reality a little bit. And so what we did is we said, well, let's try and narrow this down a little bit. So we took the top 20% of those areas which we thought were pretty good for renewable energy storage, and that comes up to about 260,000 square kilometres. And then we said, well, what? Came up with this scenario. Let's look at replacing Australia's entire LNG industry with hydrogen. How much land would that require? And you can do back of the envelope calculations to work that out. And it turns out that that would require roughly about 70,000 square kilometres for wind and about 30,000 square kilometres for hydrogen, for solar, I should say. So that's well under this range here. Remember, that value is already the top 20% of land that we've already said is prospective. So that suggests that actually it's doable. And when you consider that that huge project which I was talking about, the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, was going to occupy 6,500 square kilometres, pretty much mainly of solar, then, if you're talking 30,000 for the whole LNG, it does seem quite doable. But there is a limitation, that's water. especially if you're looking at producing hydrogen inland. This is a nice photo up around the Ord Valley, Ord River. And we, as part of our report that was feeding into the hydrogen strategy, we really looked at the water issue a bit. So we said, well, you know, let's firstly have a look. If you're going to produce hydrogen inland using CCS, really you're confined to around these areas. So that's the Cooper Basin and the Surat Basin. And you could see that this was what, back in November or September type, so about 6 months ago. And at that time, we were in the middle of a massive drought. We still are, but we hadn't had any rain then. And you can see that the surface water resources and storage were all running very low. So out here, there's no surface water storage. So the only water that you could use out there is groundwater. And of course, the Great Artesian Basin, especially in Queensland, is already fully allocated. And so the hydrogen industry would have to negotiate to get access to the water which is already fully allocated, to outcompete other industries, essentially, for that water. That's one issue. The other issue is that, particularly in the Surat Basin here, there's not just the issue of water, but there's also the issue of access to pore space. So the CSG industry, they dewater the coal seams, it produces brackish water, they have to treat that water with reverse osmosis. The brine goes into salt ponds, and then you're left with all the water. Much of that water, well, a good portion of that water is re-injected into groundwater systems, and in fact is re-injected into the precipice sandstone, which is the very formation that we're looking at storing our CO2. So it does make, so there's a real competition of how do you get access to that pore space in any case. So it was interesting to see that when the National Hydrogen Strategy came out, that groundwater didn't make the cut. The only water resources that were considered in the National Hydrogen Strategy was coastal desalination and wastewater recycling. And that was something actually we put in our report to say, well, you know, you could get, there's actually quite a lot of wastewater floating around. So for example, actually I'll come to that a little bit later. But anyway, those were the two major sources. So surface water and groundwater didn't make the cut. These were the only water resources that were considered in the strategy. Okay, how much water is needed? So yes, this is an interesting thing. So if we're going to, again, replace our LNG industry with hydrogen, for example, into the future, how much water would we need? Well, let's start first. 74 million tonnes of LNG in terms of energy values worth about 34 million tonnes of hydrogen. To produce 34 million tonnes of hydrogen, if you're going to do that with electrolysis, you need 279 gigalitres of water. Sounds like a big number. What does that really mean? Well, the mining industry currently uses about double that value. So that scale is about right. It's not outrageous. You know, you're not talking about 10 times more than the mining industry is currently using. And remember, this water is coming from coastal water desalination and from wastewater recycling. And in fact, if we get to the wastewater recycling, it's really interesting. The City of Sydney discharges 463 gigalitres of wastewater into the ocean each year. So that, you know, when we're talking we only need 279 gigalitres, cities already have vast amounts of water within them. And so they could be used also as a water resource. One of the other things that we were charged to do as part of informing the strategy was to produce this online tool for the Coag Energy Council called OzH2. So many thanks to the Hellfish team and Simon van der Wielen and Rowan and all the guys who are contributing to this. This is a really great effort. So what we did is those maps that we produced that fed into the hydrogen strategy, we made an online version of these. And not only that, but you could change the parameters. So you say, well, you know, actually I'm only going to use 20% wind rather than 50% wind. I'm going to go off grid, so I don't need existing infrastructure and all this type of stuff. So you could optimize it and run your own simulations about how which areas look the most suitable. And it's this hydrogen mapper tool down there. We're currently revising that and making a function where you can not only just access the national data set holdings that we have here, but you can actually import your own data layer and do the calculation on the fly in this tool. That's an amazing new innovation that GA is introducing to enable someone to do that without, with very little GIS skills, you can do really impressive calculations. It's fair to say that, the last decade or so have been a bit tricky in terms of climate policy. I think the hydrogen is offering a circuit breaker here. It addresses a lot of the concerns of different political parties. It's the jobs and growth, it's high-value jobs, export industry, advanced technology. All the states and territories are keen. Everyone wants to get in to produce hydrogen and become a hydrogen exporter. But it's also a really fantastic way for decarbonisation of the Australian economy. So while the National Hydrogen Strategy talks up the jobs and the exports and all the economic value of this new industry, it actually is serving a really important role in decarbonising the Australian economy. So which takes me to my final slide. Okay, this is our friend Jules Verne. And this is his rocket, picture of his rocket going to the moon. Again, remember, late 1800s. It looks remarkably like the first rocket that went to the moon, with this little moon, the lander is at the top here, as you can see. And so what I'm interested in is, what are some of the predictions that Jules Verne predicted that haven't happened yet, that might be important for today? And so I think the most prescient of his novels would have to be this one here, which is called, let me find the name, which isn't in France, but I think it's The Purchase of the North Pole. And in this one, so you've got to remember, so Jules Verne has predicted all these things in the future, but this is one of his books that he talks about. And I'm going to I'll refer to my notes here because it's really quite interesting. Okay, so in a story, he tells the story of some wealthy businessmen that, having been foiled trying to buy the moon, now buy the North Pole. They come from the US, of course, right? Their devious plan is to change the climate of the Earth so they can melt the Arctic and then mine the Arctic for its fossil fuel resources and become fabulously wealthy. So there's a couple of things here, right? One is the commercialization of space and the fact that companies are already looking at mining the moon, and it's not inconceivable that in the future companies will own parts of the moon, right? The other one, of course, is the exploitation of companies of the melting Arctic is definitely on the cards. So Jules Verne offers us two visions of the future. One, a new energy future using hydrogen replacing fossil fuels, or one where we see continued exploitation of fossil fuels to bring fabulous wealth to the few. Let's see which vision plays out over the next 30 years. Thank you.
Well, that was very interesting. Questions, please.
Great talk, Andrew. I was wondering if you could comment on your CCS hydrogen scenario.
Yeah.
What's been happening in the CCS space? Is that scalable within the time frame we need to do that to actually be a big part of this hydrogen mix?
As you would be aware, with the National Hydrogen Strategy, they wanted to go technology agnostic in that. That was a really important feature of that, so it had to consider CCS and also renewable hydrogen. I think it's just a matter of economics. So if the renewable energy costs come down in terms of electrolysis producing it's just going to be defined by that. I think the people that I've spoken to in the renewables field say the price will come down tremendously as soon as there's a market there And it depends then where the CCS can compete. Yeah.
Hi Andrew, excellent talk. Your cost of production, can you bring that slide up? And I'm curious
Sure.
to whether it includes, given you've got dependencies for CCS, does it include the cost of CCS in those numbers?
Yes.
It does.
Yeah, that's the thing. So even with CCS, that's the cost. Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew, look, your scenario too with hydrogen manufacturing on the coast, do
Yeah.
you take into account the energy transmission losses of transmitting electricity over hundreds of kilometres, which is I think about 10% every 100 kilometres?
No, this is very high level. So no, we didn't do that. And in fact, I mean, we didn't calculate like volumes of hydrogen or anything like that. It was just based on the resource and the proximity of the resource. That said, we are at the moment starting up a project where we'll do a sort of economics fairways type of approach to hydrogen production, and we're looking at, you know, doing an assessment on sort of economics type values, and so that would be an important consideration for sure.
If you're sourcing the water from desalination, what proportion of energy goes to desalination versus then the actual hydrogen production?
Surprisingly little. I thought it would have been a lot higher, but it's about 2%. Yeah.
Question up the back here.
I was going to ask the same thing.
Oh.
Yeah.
Sandy.
A related question, Andrew. So if you use wastewater for this purpose, what actually happens to the waste after the water is decomposed?
So once you've zapped your water,
Yeah.
okay, so with the electrolysis, if you hit the water, basically you're turning the water into two gases, so oxygen and hydrogen. And so the oxygen, at the moment, it's really funny actually, these electrolyzers, I went to University of New South Wales, I went into their analytical labs, and they have a little hydrogen generator on the benchtop next to the instruments, because it's much safer to produce hydrogen in small volumes just on the desk on your benchtop to supply the instruments rather than having tanks of hydrogen, all this pipeline and everything. So this technology is out there, but what happens is, so it zaps the water, produces hydrogen, and also produces oxygen. In that environment, the oxygen is just vented into the air. But you could capture that pure oxygen, right? That has a market value and could be used in wastewater industry for oxygenation and all sorts of things. Yeah.
Follow-on question. So it's not just hydrogen and oxygen in that water, though, right? And the same would be true of the coastal waters. There's a whole bunch of other things in there, the nasties or even the salt itself. Where does all that go, and what is the impact on the environment?
Yeah, okay, so currently with the electrolyzers, so you can go and buy a shipping container that is fully kit out, right? So you can produce your own, it's got everything in there, all the machines, electrolyzers, everything. You just plug it in, hook up the water pipe, turn it on, off it goes. What it has to do in that sort of environment, it has to purify the water, so it has to use a reverse osmosis to make the water extremely pure to produce the hydrogen and the oxygen. So at the moment, yeah, that would, I guess, just go to waste. And I assume that's the similar sort of situation actually with the, because it's not going to be 100% efficient, right? So you've got a lot of water, you zap some of that water to produce the oxygen and water, but you kind of, I assume, kind of flowing it through. Yeah, not a good answer, but my best.
Any further questions? Can do probably a couple more. I'm not even time. So Andrew, one, two, three, I think.
Just a real quick one. Great talk, Andrew. What about the risk? Because you mentioned town gas, and from my memory, some of those town gas storage facilities blew up in the US and killed many people. How do you, what's the risk profile for going to hydrogen? Because I know you probably don't want to touch on it, but
No.
in the labs we have, they have red bodies for a very good reason for hydrogen because of the goes in the blood.
One of the four key criteria of the National Hydrogen Strategy, apart from being, number in the top 3 for hydrogen exports, is to have a safe hydrogen industry. That's really identified. And I guess, you know, hydrogen is used in the industrial sphere quite a lot. So there is a lot of hydrogen that is produced in the industrial situation. And in fact, I think the US has 2,500 kilometres of pure hydrogen pipelines already that are operating. But yeah, there are, there's a hydrogen refuelling station just over there in Fyshwick now. And yeah, it's a recognised issue. The thing about hydrogen is, of course, it's a lot lighter than methane. So, but it's also, its flammability point is much broader. So with methane, I think it's, I can't remember the entire numbers, but methane, say, it's a range of about 15%. With hydrogen, it's a range of about 60% or something like that, or 70%, might even be higher. But the thing is, hydrogen disperses very quickly, for it's very light. So it's a different mix, a different kind of risk to, say, working with natural gas, but it can be managed. Yeah.
Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, infrastructure question. So basically you need to replace all these existing metal pipes with plastic and also create new plastic pipelines. What would be the environmental impact of this infrastructure rebuilding, and what would be the CO2 contribution? Is it actually incorporated in this analysis?
No, it's definitely not incorporated in this analysis, but it's worth saying that a lot of that infrastructure is already getting towards end of life anyway. So it does need replacing. And that's why in the ACT, for example, they've been replacing all our gas lines with plastic already. Yeah.
The one here at the front? No.
Oh, I had the same question about safety because it was really interesting to see historical context that would be there before, but then there was this Hindenburg.
Oh, the Hindenburg, yeah. I was thinking about whether I should include that as a slide or not. Yeah, I mean, that said, hydrogen is extensively used in industry today, right? But not in the domestic sense. But the Hindenburg is really interesting. You read different things about that. So in some cases, they say that, you know, because it was hit by lightning, the hydrogen went poof, but it was actually the diesel and the outer coating of the thing that sent all the flames up. So in fact, it would have done the same no matter what gas was actually inside there. So I don't know which one's true, but I think, yeah, safety is a key issue. Yeah.
Lucky last question.
Yeah, last one. A question, because from point of view of physics, it is a highly vibrated process. So will it affect climate change even worse in the sense that it will be like a greenhouse effect because you're getting more and more water into the air?
No, I wouldn't say so.
Because H2, you know, when it's due to oxidation, you know, the energy, and it produces water. What is also
yeah, I think the timescales for the water recycling in the environment is much different to CO2, right? So that is less of an effect. The water. Yeah. Whereas, you know, CO2 goes into the atmosphere, it stays there for a long, hundreds of years. Its impact is long lasting, whereas the water is recycled faster in the environment.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We'll end it there. I think that was a really good presentation. As you can see, lots of questions. We might we're right on time, so I'll just finish and thank everyone for coming. Just to let you know that next week, we'll be having Professor Peter Adol from the University of Canberra. He's going to be here to talk about the digital divide between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, which will be a very interesting topic, and hopefully everyone can make it as well as some others. So thank you.